Welcome to the deep dive. You know, usually when you look at the anatomy of a major metropolis, there's this underlying expectation that you're just looking at physical engineering.
Right, like you want to see the literal nuts and bolts of the place.
Exactly. You pull up a map for your trip, you see the subway lines, the power grids, the arterial highways, and the urban planner just points and says, yep, there it is. That's the skeleton. That is what holds the city together.
Yeah, because it's tangible, you know? I mean, we find a lot of comfort in concrete and steel. We really like a city's foundation to be completely visible and, well, easily categorized.
We do. But then you look at a place like Osaka, and suddenly that whole structural engineering-based map just feels entirely inadequate.
Oh, completely.
Because, and this is our mission for today, we are looking at this incredible academic report, historical research on Osaka's sacred spiritual network. And reading through this, you realize we're actually looking at an urban landscape held together by something invisible.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
It's this hidden spine built right along a geological ridge called the Uemachi Plateau. And, I mean, it completely shifts how you view the city. When you walk through Osaka, you know, past the neon lights and the incredible street food and the merchant towers, you're actually walking over a connected spiritual network.
And that network acted as a mechanism for pure survival.
Right.
That's the crucial framework we need to establish here.
Yeah, lay it out for us.
Well, this isn't just some passive collection of temples and shrines. The sources we're diving into, they map out this brilliant blueprint of how a city's geography and the psychological resilience of its people interacted.
Right.
Like, this network was actively used to create spaces of profound healing. They used it to resist oppressive governments and even to manage massive citywide urban crises.
Which brings us right to the edge of the plateau where the city basically drops off into the sea.
Yeah.
And we really need to unpack the sheer geopolitical weight of Sumiyoshi Taisha.
Oh, this is such a great starting point.
Right. Because if you look at its modern reputation, you know, it's mostly associated with poetry and sailing. It's beautiful. But diving into the 14th century reality, during the Nanbokucho Schism, the northern and southern courts period, this wasn't just a place of quiet reflection.
Not at all. It was highly strategic.
It functioned as a shadow capital. In 1352, Emperor Go-Murakami of the Southern Court actually relocated his temporary government here, and he stayed for a decade.
10 whole years.
Yeah. Okay, let's unpack this, because it's hard to wrap your head around. It's essentially as if a displaced government suddenly seized the Vatican and repurposed it as a heavily armed naval headquarters.
That is a striking analogy, but honestly, it perfectly captures the reality of the Sumori clan.
Yeah.
They were the ones who ran the shrine.
Right, the priests.
Well, yes, but we have to completely strip away our modern assumption that priests back then were inherently pacifist or politically neutral. I mean, the Sumoris were formidable naval lords.
Wow.
Yeah, they monopolized the crucial maritime routes to China and Korea. So when the national political order fractured during that northern and southern courts period, that vacuum wasn't just filled by traditional armies.
It was filled by local religious centers.
Exactly. Centers that already possessed hard geographical power. What's fascinating here is how they weaponized that geography.
And the Southern Court desperately needed that leverage, right? I mean, Sumori Kunenatsu, the head priest, literally handed over his own mansion assigned in to house the emperor.
Yeah, he just gave it to him.
It completely reshapes how we understand divine authority. The Sumori weren't just offering the emperor the spiritual blessing of the sea gods. They were backing up that blessing with lethal naval supremacy.
It was a very practical arrangement. They gave the Southern Court this sense of religious invincibility, but it was wrapped in a very real, very dangerous fleet. The shrine controlled the literal gateway to the continent.
And the physical footprint of this shadow capital is still just sitting right there in the open today.
It is, yeah.
For you listening, if you visit, skip the famous Red Bridge for a second and look for this hidden gem. Find the Sumiyoshi Angu. It's the temporary palace ruins on the south side of the grounds.
It's so unassuming now.
Literally just a quiet lawn with a stone monument. But standing there, you have to realize that for 10 years, this patch of grass was the gravitational center of Japanese geopolitics.
And you can even see it in the architecture, right?
Yes. The 4 main national treasure halls, they all directly face west. They are staring right out at the sea, reinforcing that ancient maritime order.
It's a permanent architectural reminder that in Osaka, spiritual power and practical logistical power were never separate things. They were completely intertwined.
And that fusion of geographical advantage and authority, it didn't just stay on the coast either. As the centuries rolled on into the Edo period, the locus of power shifted inland.
And the weapon of choice changed, too.
Exactly, from naval fleets to sheer economic capital, and we see this brilliantly illustrated at our next stop, Osaka Tenmangu.
So the dynamics of the Edo period are really essential to grasp here. The Tokugawa shogunate enforced this notoriously rigid class hierarchy.
Right, the caste system.
Yeah, and the merchants were deliberately placed at the absolute bottom of that social ladder. The government essentially said, you are the lowest of the low.
Even though they were the ones with all the money.
Exactly. They were the engine of the entire economy, but they were politically neutered.
But reading the sources, it's clear Osaka's merchants were entirely unwilling to just accept that subservience. I mean, they had immense wealth, and they decided to convert that financial capital into intellectual artillery.
Which is such a smart move.
It really is. In 1724, they pooled their resources and founded their own private academy, the Kaitokudo. And they built it directly adjacent to the Osaka Tenmangu Shrine.
And aligning their academy with the shrine's deity of scholarship, that wasn't just a matter of convenience. It was a calculated statement.
Oh, a total power move.
Right. They were carving out an autonomous intellectual space right under the nose of a regime that openly despised them.
But here's where it gets really interesting. The ultimate flex of that autonomy happens a century later, in 1837.
The Oshio-Heiachiro Rebellion.
Yes. You have this massive uprising, the fighting is brutal, and the subsequent fires completely devastate the city, and they burn down the vast majority of the Tenmangu Shrine. Now, conventional urban logic dictates that after a disaster of that magnitude, what do? You petition the central government for relief funds.
Right. You wait for the state to rebuild your infrastructure.
But the merchants didn't do that.
No, because waiting on the state requires you to acknowledge your dependence on it. And the Osaka merchants recognized that the destruction, ironically, provided this massive political opportunity.
They completely bypassed the shogunate. The merchant guilds, specifically this highly organized group called the Tenmagumi, they financed and executed the entire reconstruction of the shrine on their own.
Without a single coin from the government.
Not one. I look at that and I just see a masterclass in civic defiance. By rebuilding their own sacred space, they constructed a fortress of independence. They basically forced the Tokugawa regime to look at this massive, gleaming, rebuilt shrine and recognize, hey, we don't actually need you.
It's the literal architecture of self-reliance.
Yeah.
They were showing the strict shogunate that they possessed both the financial capital and the intellectual resilience to govern their own recovery.
And they made sure nobody would forget it either.
Oh, they left the receipts.
They literally carved them in stone. So for the tourists listening, here is your hidden gem. Look for the Kaitokudo ruins monument near the shrine. But more importantly, inspect the stone lanterns scattered around the shrine grounds. You will find the names of the Tenmagumi deeply engraved right into the stone.
Those aren't just decorative donations.
No, they are permanent material evidence of grassroots economic power successfully holding its ground against a hostile state.
And what's so compelling about this whole spiritual network is that this intense, defiant self-reliance wasn't just a luxury reserved for the wealthy elite.
Right, it trickled down.
Exactly. That same instinct for autonomous survival filtered all the way down to the absolute bottom of the urban hierarchy.
Which takes us into the heart of the Senishimai district, to Hozen-ji Temple. Now, if you visit this area today, it is a hyperkinetic hub. It's full of comedy clubs, theaters, restaurants. It's so alive.
But the historical reality of this space is, well, it's staggering.
It's incredibly dark. During the Edo period, Sennichimai wasn't a shopping district. It was a marginal boundary zone. It was literally the city's execution ground and a massive public graveyard.
Yeah, Hozen-ji was established in this incredibly dark space, specifically to offer 1,000 days of continuous prayers. Prayers for executed criminals, the starving, the unclaimed dead.
It was essentially a sponge designed to absorb the collective trauma of the city.
And this defining trial, the moment that really crystallized its modern identity, was the devastating 1945 Osaka air raids. The firebombing reduced the entire temple complex to ash.
Complete destruction.
Almost. The only thing left standing in the ruins was this fierce-looking stone statue of the deity Fudo Mayu.
And the story of what happened next in those ashes, I mean, it's easily the most emotional beat in these sources. You have this completely devastated population, and a desperate survivor approaches this solitary surviving statue.
They have absolutely nothing.
Nothing. No money, no formal offerings, no food to offer. So they just scoop up some water and splash it over the stone.
It's a completely improvised gesture.
Very unorthodox. But it immediately catches on. The surviving actors, the geishas, the people living on the absolute fringes of society, they all start bypassing formal religious protocol and just splashing water on the deity.
Because the formal protocols were shattered. I mean, the traditional temple systems were often expensive and exclusive. This act was immediate. It was accessible and deeply democratic.
But, and this is a question I really want to push back on for a second, how does a geographical space that starts as an execution ground and then becomes a bombed-out wasteland organically transform into an entertainment and theater district? It seems almost counterintuitive. Is there a psychological reason for that?
It is a massive leap, I agree. But if we connect this to the bigger picture of spatial memory, it actually makes perfect sense. This is fundamentally about the religious repair of a traumatized space.
Okay, how so?
Well, entertainment, comedy, theater, these are also profound forms of catharsis, right?
Yeah.
And the people who made their living in the entertainment quarters were often incredibly marginalized themselves. In this surviving statue, they found a deity that had also endured the fire.
I see.
And more importantly, a deity that accepted their raw, rule-breaking prayers. The continuous act of splashing water wasn't just a prayer, it was an accessible, democratic form of therapy for people excluded from traditional systems. They were literally washing away the darkness of the space through everyday grassroots hope.
Oh, wow. It's the sheer force of collective will overriding history. And the physical manifestation of that therapy is breathtaking. If you're visiting, you have to walk down the stone-paved Hozen-ji Yokocho alley to feel this. Look for the Mizukaki Fudo.
The water-splashing Fudo.
Right. You aren't really looking at a stone carving anymore. The statue is entirely engulfed in this thick, lush, green moss. And you realize every single millimeter of that moss represents decades of continuous, desperate, and hopeful prayers from ordinary people. It is a living, breathing monument to survival.
It perfectly illustrates the democratization of faith. And that specific impulse, to find an accessible way to process urban trauma, it eventually had to scale up.
Because the city was growing.
Rapidly. As Osaka industrialized into the Meiji era, the city was hit with a much darker, strictly logistical nightmare, which was mass mortality.
Which brings us to our next stop, where the city had to solve this massive crisis, Isshin-ji Temple. And the historical irony of where the solution takes place is wild.
Oh, complete.
Because Isshin-ji originally operated with the highest level of elite protection. Tokugawa Ieyasu actually used this exact location as his military headquarters during the 1614 siege of Osaka.
So it started as a fortress of the elite.
Exactly. But by the late 19th century, the temple is facing an entirely different kind of siege. Rapid urbanization meant millions of rural workers were just flooding into Osaka's factories.
And that industrialization completely fractured the traditional Danka system.
Explain the Danka system for us really quick.
Sure. In that system, your ancestral remains are cared for by your family temple back in your rural hometown. You have a formal connection.
Yeah.
But these migrant workers, they were severed from those networks. They had no family temple in Osaka.
They were entirely disconnected. So you have this massive population facing the terrifying psychological prospect of dying completely untended in a cold, indifferent factory town.
The city was facing a literal crisis of abandoned, untended remains.
Right. And Isshin-ji had to completely reinvent the concept of the afterlife on the fly.
And their solution was, it's an absolute logistical and theological marvel. In 1887, Isshin-ji announced they would start taking the ashes of the deceased, regardless of wealth.
Regardless of class.
Regardless of their specific Buddhist sect.
Yeah.
Anyone.
Which is completely radical. And they didn't just store the ashes in an urn, right? They ground the ashes up, mixed them with clay, and cast them into massive statues called Okatsubutsu, the bone Buddhas.
Yeah.
So what does this all mean? When you really think about the mechanics of this, it's basically the ultimate urban melting pot, but for the afterlife. The ashes of a wealthy merchant and the ashes of a poor dock worker are literally physically fused together inside a single Buddha.
It completely erased class lines and death. And more importantly, it was a brilliant cure for the psychological terror of dying alone in a city.
Because you aren't alone anymore.
Exactly. If your ashes went into the Okosabutsu, your new family became the millions of other citizens forming the statue. You were absorbed into the very fabric of the deity protecting Osaka.
It's really praised as one of Japan's most successful religious reforms because it provided absolute unconditional inclusion.
And as a visitor, standing in the Nakatsudo, the Bone Buddha Hall today, is an overwhelmingly powerful experience. You're standing face to face with a statue engineered from hundreds of thousands of human lives. It really changes the energy of the room.
It does. And the temple refuses to let this concept stagnate. If you look at the main gate of Isshin-ji today, it isn't some ancient, weathered wooden structure. It is a jarringly modern geometric steel and concrete gate designed by a contemporary architect.
Which proves the space remains radically open and forward-thinking.
Exactly. Now, we've talked a lot about protecting the dead. But survival in Osaka wasn't just about managing mortality. It was also about protecting the living.
Right, from disease, but also from the aggressive overreach of the government itself.
Which drops us right into the wild history of Nambayasaka Shrine. Honestly, if you pull up a picture of the shrine right now, it looks almost surreal.
It really does.
The main hall is dominated by this colossal, multi-story, roaring lion's head. It has this intense 1970s aesthetic, but hidden beneath that modern architecture is a deeply serious, ancient story of community survival and plague.
So historically, the local surrounding Nambayasaka worshipped Gozu Tenno. He was an incredibly complex deity associated with plagues.
Feared, but also revered.
Right? Feared for bringing illness, but revered for his power to ward it off. And the community relied on this massive, highly energized tug-of-war ritual dedicated to him to predict the year's fortunes and protect the neighborhood.
But then the Meiji government sweeps into power, and they enforce this strict legal separation of Shinto and Buddhism.
Shimbutsu Bunri.
Yes. The state decides Gozu Tenno is far too deeply tied to Buddhist influences, so they outright ban his worship.
They just outlaw it.
Yep. They demand the shrine worship a state-approved Shinto god instead, Susanoo. So this local community is suddenly facing the total erasure of their most vital protective ritual by government decree.
Yeah.
So how did the locals sneak their traditions past the government censors?
Well, they employ what the sources beautifully term mythological resilience. The locals understood they couldn't win a direct physical confrontation with the state, so they brilliantly exploited a theological loophole.
They rebranded it.
They simply rebranded the tug-of-war. They looked at the government officials and claimed, oh no, we aren't worshiping the band of plague god anymore.
Not at all.
These massive ropes we're pulling. They actually represent the eight-headed mythical serpent from the Shinto texts. And our ritual is just honoring the state-approved god, Susanoo, slaying it.
It's the ultimate civic hustle. They weaponized mythology against bureaucracy, they slapped a government-approved label onto their ancient practice, and it allowed their community's psychological immune system to survive completely untouched.
They outsmarted the state to keep their traditions alive.
They really did. So for the tourists, yes, highlight the giant lion hall. Its massive teeth and eyes are designed to swallow bad luck, and it's a great photo. But the real secret is looking for that massive rope used in January's Tsunehiki Shinji ritual.
The eight-headed, eight-tailed rope.
Exactly. When you look at that rope, you are looking at the exact physical loophole a city used to outmaneuver the national government.
And that profound instinct for survival. I mean, we've seen naval supremacy, merchant rebellions, moss-covered guardians, bone Buddhas, and giant ropes. This raises an important question. What is the ultimate purpose of this geographic network? Where does all this localized spiritual energy actually converge?
It all funnels directly up the plateau to Shitenno-ji.
Right at the center.
Founded in 593, it sits as the anchor at the very center of the Uemachi Plateau. But it has this glaring architectural anomaly that reveals its true purpose. Shitenno-ji is a Buddhist temple, yet standing at its west entrance is a massive, definitively Shinto-style stone torii gate.
Which you rarely see left standing after the Meiji-era separations.
Exactly. Why is it there? Because in 1294, a revolutionary monk named Ninsho utilized another brilliant theological hack. He stood at that stone gate and formally declared that it was the exact literal eastern entrance to the Western paradise.
And Ninsho's declaration wasn't just abstract theology, right? He backed it up with a radically inclusive social mission.
Right.
He believed that the people who were the most broken and marginalized by society were inherently the closest to Buddhist salvation. So he leveraged the authority of that gate to set up welfare and medical facilities right at its base.
Wow.
Yes, specifically targeting the beggars, the disabled, and the absolute outcasts of the city.
It's the perfect synthesis of everything we've talked about. Think about this next time you visit Osaka. Whether you were a highly educated, wealthy merchant at Tenmangu proving your independence, or you were a completely broke, outcast actor splashing water on a mossy statue at Hozen-ji, your spiritual trajectory ultimately led up the physical slope of the plateau to this exact stone gate.
It all led there.
You would stand there, looking west through the torii as the sun set over Osaka Bay, and it served as a grand, equalizing gateway to paradise. The geography of the city literally leveled the playing field of the human soul.
It completely reframes how we should look at urban planning. The city itself, utilizing its natural geography, was engineered over centuries to be an engine for collective salvation.
It's incredibly moving. It ensures I will never look at a map of a city the same way again. Thank you all for coming along on this incredible mapping of Osaka's hidden soul.
And before we sign off, I want to offer one final, provocative thought to linger on. This is drawn directly from the archaeological evidence in the sources.
Okay, let's hear it.
A few years ago, researchers opened up some of the ancient statues inside Shitenno-ji to examine the interiors. Now, normally, you expect to find old sutra scrolls or official dedications in there.
Right, standard artifacts.
But they didn't just find scrolls. They found thousands upon thousands of tiny pieces of folded paper, secretly deposited by ordinary people centuries ago.
Wait, what was inside the papers?
Fingernails, locks of human hair, dried umbilical cords, and tiny bone fragments.
Oh, wow. The absolute desperation and hope in that act is staggering. These ordinary citizens were so determined to secure their place in that salvation that they physically smuggled pieces of their own bodies into the gateway of paradise.
To ensure they wouldn't be left behind.
It makes you wonder, in our modern hyper-digital cities today where our infrastructure is mostly fiber optic cables and cloud servers, where do we go to anchor our existence so permanently? The actual physical pieces of the people who built the city are still there, hidden in the statues and the moss, holding the entire network together. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.